Dr. Gregory Stanton is the founding president of Genocide Watch and chair of the Alliance Against Genocide. He's done so many amazing things throughout his long career. He directed the relief program in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, following the overthrow of the Khmer Rouge regime. He founded the Cambodian Project in 1982. While in the US State Department, he drafted the UN Security Council resolutions that established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He was a driving force in the establishment of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. He proposed and lobbied for the creation of the UN Office for the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide Scholars. He was a president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He's probably best known to many people for, first of all, his 8 stages of genocide that then metamorphosized into the 10 stages of genocide. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Stanton to give the keynote.
Well, it's a huge honor for me to be able to address this distinguished conference. I must say the presentations have just been stunningly good. And I'm so grateful to hear from all of the educators who've really brought this whole field of genocide studies to life. I remember when we started Genocide Watch, there wasn't any other anti-genocide organization out there. I couldn't believe it, actually, having worked, to create these tribunals when I was in the State Department. And I looked around. Of course, there were Holocaust museums. Of course, there were great human rights organizations like Amnesty, which I'd been part of almost from the start, and Human Rights Watch, and others, many others. But there wasn't any organization that was really focused on this problem of genocide. And so I realized that we needed such an organization. And of course, that's why we founded the Genocide Watch, and at the same time founded the Alliance Against Genocide, because the advisors I consulted, including some of the advisors who founded the International Crisis Group, said, don't found another pyramid, make it a network, because networks are the most powerful way to organize a mass movement. I looked at the histories of other mass movements, at the anti-slavery movement, a movement, by the way, that was where one of the leaders was one of my ancestors, Henry Brewster Stanton, and the women's movement, where again one of my ancestors, his wife, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and that was absolutely good advice. I mean, they founded networks. So that is why the Alliance Against Genocide was founded. And it was founded at the same time as Genocide Watch. Now we have over 120 member organizations in the Alliance. We have many other organizations that even aren't part of the Alliance, but which are doing this wonderful work against genocide. We have other organizations oriented towards governments. We now have an office as a special advisor on the prevention of genocide at the UN. We are part of a mass movement already. And why are we needed? Because during the 20th century, over 100 million people were murdered by their own governments. That is more deaths than from all the wars combined. Deaths and genocide and political mass murder were only exceeded by deaths from diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, AIDS, and influenza. Genocide is committed by people who have lost sight of our common humanity. All humans belong to one family, but we're born into thousands of ethnic groups that speak thousands of languages. We belong to hundreds of nations and have scores of religions. Some think there are many races, but that's their mistake, because there is really only one race, the human race. Genocide is committed by us because we become ethnocentric, racist, nationalistic, or religiously intolerant. Genocide is a form of idolatry. We worship our ethnic group or race or nation or religion instead of God. We build golden altars and sacrifice human beings upon them. Instead of blessing all humans as God's creations, we bathe our weapons with their blood. I want to speak to you today about looking backward into the future. I want to look at this from the point of view of people in 1945 who were founding the United Nations. World War II was the deadliest war in human history. 85 million people perished. Military deaths totaled 25 million, including the deaths of 5 million prisoners of war. Civilian deaths totaled 55 million. The Soviet Union lost 27 million. 19 million people died in China, including 8 to 9 million to famine and disease. The victors in World War II were determined to prevent future wars. So they founded the United Nations in 1945. Unfortunately, since its founding, the UN has been crippled by the PERM 5 veto. In 1945, it was still the colonial era. The colonial powers, including the UK, France, Russia, and China, wanted to keep their empires, including even empires where many of their parts were trying to achieve independence. The most powerful nation, the United Nations, the United States wanted to maintain its military and economic dominance. So these 5 nations, instead of insisted on having vetoes in the UN Security Council, the only UN body with power under the UN Charter to authorize the use of military force. If even one of these PERM 5 nations vetoes, the UN cannot authorize military intervention. From the beginning, Soviet vetoes paralyzed the Security Council. The PERM 5 veto has paralyzed the UN ever since. It is a fatal flaw in the UN Charter, which needs to be revised. In 1950, North Korea, with Soviet support, invaded South Korea. The USSR had made the mistake of walking out of the Security Council from January through July 1950 because the UN refused to recognize Communist China to take China's seat in the UN. During its absence, the US, UK, and France pushed through creation of a UN force to intervene in Korea. To get around Soviet vetoes and to provide a future alternative to the Security Council, the US sponsored Resolution 377A in the General Assembly, the Uniting for Peace Resolution, which states that in cases where the Security Council, because of a lack of unanimity among its 5 permanent members, fails to act as required to maintain international security and peace, the General Assembly shall consider the matter immediately and may issue appropriate recommendations to UN members for collective measures, including the use of armed force when necessary, in order to maintain or restore international security and peace. The resolution was adopted on the 3rd of November, 1950. It was designed to provide the UN with an alternative avenue for action when at least one P5 member uses its veto to obstruct the Security Council from carrying out its functions mandated by the UN Charter. To facilitate such prompt action, the resolution created the mechanism of the emergency special session. Emergency special sessions have been convened under this procedure on 11 occasions, with the most recent convened in February 2022 to address Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Although the U.S. originally sponsored the Uniting for Peace resolution, the U.S. has become very reluctant to use it. When I was a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. State Department lawyers told me, "Oh, we don't favor Uniting for Peace anymore. After all, in the General Assembly, the U.S. has no veto." Well, the U.S. has now again supported use of Uniting for Peace after Russia invaded Ukraine because Russia would have vetoed any UN action in the Security Council. I believe that the U.S. and other members of the PERM 5 should use Uniting for Peace much more often to authorize armed UN peacekeeping missions to stop genocides and to arrest their perpetrators. Our IRF Alliance Genocide Working Group has written a letter to members of the United Nations Security Council urging reestablishment of a UN and AU peacekeeping force to stop the war in Sudan and to arrest the generals who are fighting for power and committing genocide, killing thousands of Sudanese civilians. Here I ask you to sign on to our letter to the UN Security Council. It is on the IAGS listserv and on the Genocide Watch website at www.genocidewatch.com. Let me speak to you about a fundamental principle of genocide prevention. It's called the precautionary principle. It's a fundamental principle in epidemiology that was brought to my attention by my colleague, Dr. Elihu Richter. We submitted a proposal to the Albright-Cohen Commission that was considering establishment of the UN Atrocities Prevention Board. We told the Commission that the precautionary principle should be applied when risks of genocide appear. The precautionary principle states that when there is uncertainty concerning the possibility of the occurrence of a major catastrophic event, the costs of inaction far outweigh those of anticipatory preventive action. The precautionary principle shifts the burden of proof from those suspecting a catastrophic risk to those denying it. In everyday terms, the precautionary principle states that it is better to be safe than sorry. You might have seen several examples of application of the precautionary principle. For example, when you had literally thousands or millions of chickens slaughtered when bird flu began to spread in China. But we were ignored. The default policy of diplomats and world leaders when there are warning signs of genocide remains do nothing. Wait until the genocide is underway. Even then, deny that it's a genocide. And then, even if we conclude it's a genocide, because the cost of intervening will be so high, do nothing. Now, we know what the risk factors are for genocide. Barbara Harf, one of my dear colleagues and a really pioneering political scientist and scholar of genocide, outlined the political risk factors for genocide. Ongoing civil or international war, past genocide that has gone unpunished and is still denied, rule by an ethnically limited, exclusive elite, official exclusionary ideology, autocracy or totalitarianism, closure of relations with the outside world, massive human rights violations like torture and extrajudicial killings. We know the risk factors. The anti-genocide movement should work against war and for punishment of perpetrators. We should press for broadly based democratic governments. We should oppose ideologies of racial or class superiority. We should favor free trade and free speech. We should strongly oppose violations of fundamental human rights by any regime, including by our own. But these factors cannot tell us when genocide is likely to happen, and therefore they're of limited use in prevention. And that's why I developed a model of the genocidal process, the 10 stages of genocide. Now, I now regret choosing the word stages because it implies linearity in the model. And the truth is, the model is not linear. Stages may occur simultaneously or out of order. I should just have called the stages processes. They are what structural anthropologists, and I am a structural anthropologist, call a transformational structure, a system of transformations. The 10 stages of genocide provides the outline of a transformational grammar of genocidal processes. I owe these concepts, by the way, these concepts of structure to Jean Piaget and Noam Chomsky. Genocide is a process that develops in 10 stages that are predictable, but not inexorable. At each stage, preventive measures can stop it. It is also a logical model for thinking about the processes and what we can do to prevent or stop genocide. I'm sure all of you are well aware of the 10 stages of genocide, so I won't repeat them here. Now, the original memo that I wrote, actually based on a paper I wrote in 1987, but I wrote a memo in the State Department in 1996 that was intended to educate State Department officers about the genocidal process and how to stop it. Now, I knew it had to fit on one page, back and front, or it would not be read. One of my classmates at Yale Law School, Nick Rostow, once said, yeah, he says these diplomats, they have the attention span of a gnat. I'm just kidding, of course. Actually, they read a lot, but they have too much to read. That's why it had to be a 2-page memo. Little did I know, however, that it would become a paradigmatic model that is now used by teachers and policymakers around the world. I want to now rethink the law of genocide with you. I'm a lawyer trained by Myers McDougall and Michael Reisman at Yale Law School. They taught that law and policy are not two separate realms, that law is concretized policy, and law should be evaluated as policy. I'm also a cultural anthropologist trained by Victor Turner, Marshall Solins, Leo Cooper, and other social scientists. They trained me to look beneath the surface for the deeper structures and schisms that underlie societies and conflicts. An anthropological analysis of lawyers, in fact, may help us understand why the Genocide Convention has thus far failed to prevent genocide. The Genocide Convention was born toothless, and lawyers have kept it from ever outgrowing its baby teeth. The training of lawyers creates a backward-looking, adjudication-oriented view of genocide. At a conference at Cardozo Law School in 2011, a colleague put it this way: the convention was primarily meant to adjudicate an individual's criminal responsibility. That's the end of a quote. The State Department and UK Foreign Office even say now they can't even use the word genocide until a court does. They're wrong. The Genocide Convention doesn't require a court to determine that something is a genocide before policymakers can call it that. One purpose of the convention certainly is to punish genocides. But if that is all it is, we've forgotten the very name of the convention, the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The convention was meant to be forward-looking and preventive, not just a law for punishment. So why hasn't the United Nations prevented genocide? Because after the convention was written, that was the idea. The UN would be the force that would prevent genocide. The UN has failed to prevent war and genocide because it is still built on the old nation-state system. National governments still claim the right to commit crimes, even genocide, against their own citizens. Now, the responsibility to protect doctrine was supposed to overcome such claims of national sovereignty. R2P says that sovereignty doesn't come down from rulers, but rather rises up from the people. And that, by the way, is the concept of sovereignty that underlies the Declaration of Independence, all of the basic ideology of democracy. When a nation is tyrannized by its own government, its citizens have the right to overthrow that government. Under R2P, the UN and regional organizations have the right to intervene in nations that are murdering their own citizens. But very few nations are willing to sacrifice the blood of their own military troops to carry out such R2P interventions. R2P has not yet become enforceable international law. Like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is an aspirational doctrine. It's a very good doctrine, but it's still rejected by all genocidal states. Many Asian and African nations, as well as Russia and China, see R2P as an attempt by Europe and the US to reimpose colonial rule. Secondly, there is still no United Nations military force. One is authorized by Articles 43 through 47 of the United Nations Charter. The Military Staff Committee, composed of chiefs of staff of the military forces of the PERM 5 Security Council members, has never been established. The main reason is that none of the PERM 5 want a strong UN military force that could oppose their own armies. Current UN peacekeeping missions are too weak to overpower nation armies that can't stop genocides. It is time to create a UN military force like NATO's, but without NATO's requirement of unanimity to take military action. Thirdly, the International Criminal Court has no police force to arrest people it charges. Courts cannot work without police forces. Today, there is no effective international police force to arrest people charged with crimes by the International Criminal Court or by international tribunals. National police forces usually refuse to arrest genocidists because the police serve under the same leaders whom the ICC has charged. The UN also lacks a police force to prevent genocide by arresting national leaders who are planning or perpetrating genocide. We need international police, but injecting them into a nation state is still considered a violation of national sovereignty by many governments, especially genocidal regimes. The emerging international norm or the responsibility to protect may be invoked to answer such arguments, but how many nations are willing to send their army or police into other countries to face heavily armed national military forces determined to keep them out? The answer can be seen in the difficulty the UN has in recruiting troops for its peacekeeping operations, especially from countries with powerful militaries like the US, UK, France, Russia, and China. If the UN cannot muster the forces, other means must be found. One way to create an international police force would be to pass an optional protocol to the Treaty of the International Criminal Court to authorize one. It would have the authority only to execute arrest warrants for persons charged by the ICC with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But even such a police force would face resistance from genocidal states. The fundamental problem is the persistent paradigm of national sovereignty. Now, Genocide Watch has written and proposed an optional protocol to the Genocide Convention that would reaffirm the authority of the UN General Assembly to approve the use of force when the UN Security Council is paralyzed by a PERM 5 veto. This authority already exists under the Uniting for Peace resolution, and it's been used, as I said, at least 11, probably more times. It is currently being used to give the UN General Assembly jurisdiction over Russian aggression in Ukraine. The optional protocol Genocide Watch has proposed would restate and define the power of regional organizations to act under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, which gives regional organizations such authorization even before they receive a UN Security Council mandate. The fourth reason why we failed to prevent genocide is that very few educational systems, and this is why it's so important, this conference, very few educational systems aim to create anti-genocidal cultures. Genocide requires popular participation. 200,000 people participated in the slaughter of 800,000 Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994. Churches in Rwanda could have played a powerful role in creating a culture resistant to genocide in Rwanda, because many Hutus and Tutsis are Roman Catholics and attended the same churches. But the church failed. It was as ethnically divided as the rest of Rwandan society. In fact, some clergy even participated in the killings. In rethinking genocide prevention, we should pay special attention to the bottom-up dimension of genocide. How can anti-genocidal cultures be built? Religion has far too often been a cause of genocide, but what if every major religion regularly affirmed the core principle in all religions that all human beings belong to one race, the human race? We need to spark the efforts of people at the grassroots in schools, universities, seminaries, churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples all over the world. When I was in Iraq, in Kurdistan, with Elisa Forgi and Irene Massimino, and we were presenting a seminar on genocide prevention back in 2017. I learned that they were headed back to the United States and that they were going to be stopping in Rome. And I said, oh my goodness, what a great opportunity when you're there. And by the way, Irene is Argentinian, so I thought this was really a possibility. Contact the Vatican, try to get an audience with Pope Francis, and tell him about the anti-genocide movement and how important it would be if the Roman Catholic Church would join it, would become an anti-genocide church. They did. They met with Pope Francis. They talked with him for an hour. He was enthusiastic about the idea. Can you imagine if we could get the Roman Catholic Church to endorse and make it part of its central theology, the prevention of genocide? What if we could get all the churches to do that? What if we get every synagogue, temples, mosques? Can you imagine? You know, believe me, the human race is not just a material race. We're also a spiritual race. And whenever we forget that, we're losing one of the most powerful forces that motivates mankind. And fifth, to end genocide and war, women must be empowered. Women resolve conflicts very differently than men. When men have conflicts, they fight. When women have conflicts, they talk. Talking is a much better way to resolve conflicts than fighting. Not a single genocide or war in human history has been planned by groups of women. That's the elephant in the room that theorists of war and genocide try to ignore. It doesn't mean that women don't participate in wars or genocide. They do. But the wars or genocides are always planned by men, even when a queen is head of state. The only possible exception to this rule was Queen Rana Valona I, the mad monarch of Madagascar, who ruled from 1828 to 1861. Her use of regular warfare, forced labor, and harsh trials by ordeal, using a poisonous nut, exacerbated by infectious diseases, resulted in a mortality rate that reduced Madagascar's population from 5 million in 1833 to 2.5 million in 1839. But Mad Queen Rana Valona I is the exception that proves the rule. Women do not plan wars or genocides. Many more nations must elect women as their leaders. I am overjoyed that the nominee for president from the Democratic Party in the United States is now an Asian, Black American woman. See, there's still hope. We must create also, this is the sixth reason why we haven't prevented genocide. We must create the political will to prevent genocide. Many people have said that the problem in the Rwandan genocide and in Bosnia and Darfur wasn't the absence of early warning of the coming catastrophe. It was the absence of political will to prepare for and prevent it. But even when UN peacekeeping missions have been deployed, they're not given strong enough mandates to protect civilians by fighting and defeating genocides. You know the history of UNPROFOR in Yugoslavia. Until the Srebrenica massacre, UNPROFOR was not given the power, in fact, to take out the Bosnian Serb sniper nests. In Rwanda, there were 2,500 UNAMIR troops on the ground when the genocide began. Rather than reinforce them, as General Dallaire requested, the US, UK, and France led the UN Security Council to order withdrawal of all but 400 UNAMIR troops. And they stayed because the Ghanaian troops voted to stay. The Ghanaian troops were heroes. They saved hundreds of lives. And yet 2,000 French and Belgian troops were able to airlift all French and Belgians out of Rwanda with their pets. Not a single Rwandan was allowed to board the planes. The US Embassy drove out to Burundi, protected by Marine Guards. Secretly, and I knew this, but it was not known by most people, including by those who claimed that the US couldn't have intervened in time. The US had ships filled with thousands of US Marines right off the coast of East Africa when the Rwandan genocide began, with helicopters, with vehicles. But President Clinton never authorized their deployment to Rwanda. Now, political will is not a mystery. It's not mystical mumbo jumbo that is impossible to analyze and understand. Anyone who witnessed the triumph of the political campaigns of President Barack Obama should see that political will can be built up from the ground up. It is time we hold our leaders to account. We must no longer accept their excuses. President Clinton's we did not know speech in Kigali after the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda was a lie. Of course he knew. I had top secret code word clearance in the State Department in 1994, and I read the same cables that were used to brief Clinton. A cable to the State Department and National Security Council from the Department of Defense on the very first day of the genocide, on April 7th, 1994, called the mass killings genocide. Our Deputy Chief of Mission in Kigali, Joyce Leader, has told me personally she called the massacres genocide in her daily phone calls to the State Department from the first day, April 7th, onward. But unfortunately, U.S. Ambassador to Rwanda, the Africa Bureau, and the legal experts, so-called, in the State Department didn't know what genocide is. They thought the killings were part of a civil war rather than a genocide. They didn't understand that most genocides occurred during civil or international wars. Wars and genocides are not mutually exclusive. They usually go together. The seventh reason why we have failed to prevent genocide is that we have failed to arrest and hold accountable the leaders of genocides. I've always been perplexed by the unwillingness of the world's leaders to send in heavily armed commandos to arrest the leaders of genocides and take them for trial to The Hague or to other places where they can be put on trial. I mean, sure, the ICC should require preliminary hearings and an arrest warrant, but currently there are no international police to arrest the Omar al-Bashirs and the General Hametis who are leading genocides that murder thousands of people. Indeed, why is it out of the question to send in commandos who would kill such genocidal leaders if they resist and can't be arrested? Why hasn't Vladimir Putin, the leading genocidist right now in the world, been killed by a missile strike that would precisely target him in Russia? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of my heroes, was part of the plot to kill Hitler. And Martin Luther King Jr., another of my heroes and one who actually trained me and on whose platform I spoke a few times, concluded that Bonhoeffer was morally right, even though he, of course, as you know, as I do, firmly believed in nonviolent resistance. The eighth reason why we failed, and this is the final reason, is that it's time to build an international anti-genocide movement on the scale of the anti-slavery movement. We must build the political will for international intervention when genocide is imminent. When I founded Genocide Watch in 1999, there wasn't a single organization in the world entirely devoted to the prevention of genocide. And at the same time, we founded the Alliance Against Genocide. Now there are hundreds of anti-genocide organizations. This conference is an example of the growth of this movement. There are many, many anti-genocide organizations around the world who are working on this terrible problem. At the base of the problem is an absence of empathy. Empathy is the ability to place ourselves in the shoes of another. It is the measure of a person's moral capacity. Empathy is the expression of satyagraha, that great truth force that Gandhi rediscovered, and that was also taught by the Buddha, Amos, Jesus, and Martin Luther King Jr. Satyagraha is expressed in both justice and love. It has revolutionary power because justice and love flow from the same force, the force. People sometimes ask me what my theology is. I say, you seen Star Wars? I work for the force. The more I have worked against genocide, the more I have become convinced that genocide must be defeated locally. It can be prevented only by teaching people the empathy for their neighbors that will make them upstanders who will oppose the dehumanization necessary for genocide. I want to close with a poem that I wrote for a conference on the Rohingya genocide that we held at Barnard College. It's simply called Justice. Can justice come in courts? Can a widow's tears be dried by trials? Can a rape girl's shame be healed by ceremonies? Can a fatherless child be consoled? What is justice to a woman whose children were slaughtered just before she was raped? What is justice to a bride whose husband's last caress was the last she will ever know? What is justice to a woman who will never trust a man again? What is justice to an orphan in a refugee camp? What is justice to lawyers who still won't call it genocide? Justice is the spirit of the law. Without justice, law is dead, like an empty skull. Without justice, there can be no reconciliation. Without justice, love cannot reweave the social fabric. Without justice, hope dies. Without justice, death conquers life. Justice establishes the truth. Justice restores dignity to the victims. Justice recognizes a widow's grief. Justice is digging up bones and giving them proper burial. Justice is telling stories of suffering to somebody who really listens. Justice is confession that your country was responsible. Justice is always having to say you're sorry. Justice struggles to understand why people do such evil. Justice affirms that the rule of law is stronger than rule by force. Justice says murderers cannot get away with genocide. Justice is the antidote to abandonment. Justice is reconnection with the human race. Justice restores the social order. Justice rebalances the moral universe. Justice is God's force socially expressed. Love is God's force personally expressed. With justice and love, hope returns. Hope is the assurance that life will triumph over death. Thank you.
Giving that a moment to sit with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Stanton, for giving us an inspirational ending to the day and for all of the effort that you've put in to help us make these 2 days such a success. And with that, I also want to thank Lorna, who I think is still on the line. I want to thank Kim Klett. I want to thank Jim. I want to thank Tawhid. All of you have been part of meetings for months and months to make sure that these 2 days were as invigorating and inspiring as they have been. I also want to thank the International Association for Genocide Scholars for their sponsorship and endorsement of the event. I want to thank officially, in addition to Dr. Stanton, I want to thank the Alliance Against Genocide for their willingness to sponsor the event, and to all of my colleagues and the whole team at the Educators Institute for Human Rights. I thank you for your hard work and for everything you've done to support this work. To all of you who attended and came as participants, I want to thank you especially, and especially those of you who have gotten up at strange hours of the day or stayed up until weird hours of the evening, but you've been here for the whole thing, because we see you, we know you've been here, and we appreciate it. We appreciate your commitment. We appreciate your passion. We appreciate that you care about how education can play a role in preventing and responding to genocide. I wish you all a wonderful weekend. And if you haven't seen them yet, I haven't yet. I've tried not to watch. A wonderful opening of the Paris Olympics. And with that, I bid you all farewell.